Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the frozen frontiers of Alaska, places where the cold can kill in minutes, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. In the vast wilderness of America's last frontier, bush pilots serve as lifelines, connecting isolated communities with the outside world. Their job requires navigating treacherous weather, landing on makeshift airstrips, and sometimes venturing into the unknown to rescue those in need. Across these frozen tundras, mountain ranges, and remote villages are accounts drawn from flight logs, rescue reports, and witness testimonies. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. These are the stories of Alaska's bush pilots, the brave souls who fly where others dare not, sometimes never to return. In temperatures dropping to 30 below zero, where mechanical failures become life-threatening and visibility can vanish in seconds, these pilots face challenges unimaginable to most. Their aircraft become both salvation and potential coffins as they navigate through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. What happens when routine flights become something else entirely? When rescue missions lead to encounters that defy explanation? The stories we'll explore tonight come from the official records of the Alaska State Troopers, the Civil Air Patrol, and the Federal Aviation Administration. They represent some of the most disturbing cases in bush aviation history incidents where the extreme cold wasn't the only danger lurking in the Alaskan wilderness. These are accounts that have left even the most experienced pilots questioning what they truly saw out there, beyond the reach of civilization. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was late November of 1998, when veteran bush pilot Mark Richardson prepared for what should have been a routine flight. At 47 years old, Mark had been flying the Alaskan skies for over 2 decades, earning a reputation as one of the most reliable pilots in the region. His Cessna 185 Skywagon, a trusty aircraft he'd nicknamed the Workhorse, had carried him through every kind of weather Alaska could throw at a pilot. The temperature that morning hovered at 28 degrees below zero in Fairbanks, where Mark was preparing to fly supplies to the remote village of Alakeket, some 250 miles to the northwest. The pre-flight inspection proceeded as usual, with Mark methodically checking every component of his aircraft. The maintenance logs showed everything in perfect order, and the engine started with a familiar roar that had become comforting to him over the years. Air traffic control cleared him for departure at 8:17 a.m. with no indication of the strange circumstances that would soon unfold. Mark's last transmission to the Fairbanks Tower was routine. Cessna 281 to Fairbanks, departing runway 20, Alakeket bound. Weather looks clear, should be there by lunchtime. The first 2 hours of the flight proceeded without incident. Mark maintained regular contact with air traffic control, providing position reports as required. At 10:23 a.m., he radioed in from over the small community of Hughes, approximately halfway to his destination. Fairbanks, Cessna 281. Just passed over Hughes, everything running smoothly. Temperature holding at -30. We'll check in from above the Koyukuk River. This would be the last normal communication anyone would receive from Mark Richardson. What happened next has puzzled aviation experts and investigators for over 2 decades. At approximately 10:47 a.m., air traffic control received a fragmented transmission from Flight 281. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Mark's voice sounding uncharacteristically agitated. Fairbanks, Cessna 281. I've got something on the wing. No, not ice. It's reflective. My God, it's... The transmission then cuts to static for precisely 12 seconds before Mark's voice returns, now eerily calm. Never mind. False alarm. Just sunlight playing tricks on the eye. Continuing to Alakeket. Air traffic controller Sarah Jenkins, who was on duty that morning, later told investigators that something about Mark's voice in that final transmission deeply unsettled her. "I've known Mark for years," she said in her official statement. "He was always professional, never flustered. But in that first part of the transmission, he sounded genuinely frightened. Then the shift to complete calm was unnatural. It was like someone else was speaking." When Mark failed to arrive at Allakaket by his estimated arrival time of 11:30 a.m., concerns began to mount. The village had no radio contact with him after his 10:47 a.m. transmission. Search and rescue operations were launched at 1:15 p.m., with 3 additional aircraft combing the route Mark should have taken. The weather remained clear, with excellent visibility, making his disappearance even more baffling. The search continued for 11 days, covering over 15,000 square miles of wilderness. Not a single trace of Mark Richardson or his Cessna 185 was ever found. No wreckage, no oil slick on the rivers or lakes below, no emergency beacon signal, nothing. The official investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded with the unsatisfying classification of disappeared for unknown reasons. What makes this case particularly disturbing are the reports from other pilots who were flying in the area that day. 2 separate pilots, flying routes approximately 30 miles from Mark's last known position, reported seeing unusual atmospheric phenomena. Jim Halverson, a pilot with 25 years of experience, described seeing a vertical column of light that appeared to be hovering just above the treetops. Another pilot, Maria Rodriguez, reported strange metallic reflections in the sky that didn't correspond to any known aircraft or natural phenomena. Perhaps most unsettling is the testimony of an elder from the village of Allakaket, who spoke with investigators on condition of anonymity. The elder recounted an ancient Athabascan legend about sky spirits that occasionally interfere with those who travel through their domain. "Sometimes they take people," the elder explained, "not to harm them, but because they are lonely. The people are never seen again, but sometimes their voices can be heard on the wind." To this day, the disappearance of Flight 281 remains one of Alaska's most baffling aviation mysteries. The NTSB file remains open, though inactive, classified as NTSB file number NCN 98FA118. Mark Richardson's name appears on the Alaska Aviation Memorial in Anchorage, alongside others who have vanished in the vast northern skies. No trace was ever found. 300 miles away, another pilot was about to discover that some rescue missions become more complicated than anyone could anticipate. It was January of 2004, and temperatures in the Tanana River Basin had dropped to a brutal 32 degrees below zero. 58-year-old pilot Daniel Dan O'Hara received an emergency call at 6:40 a.m. from the Alaska State Troopers. A family of 2 adults and 1 child was stranded in a remote cabin near the confluence of the Tanana and Yukon rivers. Their heating system failed and supplies running dangerously low. Dan was a former military pilot with over 30 years of bush flying experience in Alaska. His de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver, nicknamed Old Reliable, was specially equipped for winter rescue operations with skis for landing on frozen terrain and an upgraded heating system for the cabin. As he prepared for departure from Fairbanks, the weather report showed clear skies but warned of dropping temperatures throughout the day. "Not ideal conditions," Dan noted in his personal log, "but nothing I haven't handled before." The flight to the remote cabin normally took about an hour and 45 minutes. Dan maintained radio contact with the Fairbanks Flight Service Station for the first hour of his journey, providing routine position reports. At 8:15 a.m., he reported passing over the town of Manly Hot Springs, approximately halfway to his destination. "Everything's running smoothly down here," his transmission recorded. "Temperatures holding at -31. Should be on site in approximately 45 minutes. What happened next has become one of the most discussed incidents in Alaska's aviation community. At approximately 8:47 a.m., Dan radioed in with an urgent message. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Rescue Flight 749er. I've got engine trouble. Losing altitude fast. Attempting emergency landing on the Tanana." The transmission then dissolved into static, with Dan's voice barely audible shouting something about "not right," before cutting off completely. Search and rescue operations were immediately launched, but the extreme cold and remote location complicated efforts. 2 other aircraft attempted to reach Dan's last known position, but were forced back by deteriorating weather conditions. It wasn't until the following morning that a rescue team finally located the crash site. What they found would defy logical explanation. Dans Beaver had made a relatively smooth emergency landing on the frozen Tanana River. The aircraft was largely intact, with minimal damage to the fuselage. The rescue team found the family Dan had been sent to evacuate huddled inside the cabin, all alive but suffering from severe hypothermia. What they didn't find was any sign of Dan O'Hara himself. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case 043789, details the bizarre scene. The pilot's door was wide open despite the sub-zero temperatures. Dan's parka and gloves were found, neatly folded on the passenger seat. His boots were still on, with the laces tied in his usual double knot pattern, placed beside the folded clothing. The engine, which Dan had reported as failing, was examined by mechanics and found to be in perfect working order, with fuel in the tank and no signs of mechanical failure. Perhaps most disturbing were the footprints found in the snow around the aircraft. They led away from the plane toward the dense forest on the riverbank, then simply stopped after about 50 yards, as if Dan had vanished into thin air. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no other trace of him. No body, no additional tracks, no indication of what had happened to the experienced pilot. The family Dan had rescued provided a fragmented account of what they remembered. According to their testimony, Dan had landed the plane and helped them aboard. He was preparing to take off when he suddenly stopped, staring out the windshield at something in the distance. He just said, "I'll be right back. Need to check something," the father recounted. He stepped out of the plane, and that was the last we saw of him. We waited for hours, but the cold was too much. Finally, we had to close the door to survive. The investigation into Dan's disappearance raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file number ANC04FA043, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's disappearance could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from Dan experiencing sudden onset of hypothermia-induced confusion to more supernatural explanations involving local legends about the Tanana River. Native elders from the nearby village of Ruby spoke of ancient stories about the river walkers entities that appear during extreme cold conditions and lead people away from safety. According to these traditions, those who follow the river walkers are never seen again, becoming part of the river itself. "The river takes what it wants," one elder explained to investigators, "especially when it's this cold." To this day, the Tanana rescue incident remains unexplained. Dan O'Hara was officially declared dead in 2007, 3 years after his disappearance. His aircraft was recovered and now serves as a training tool for aviation mechanics, who continue to marvel at its perfect condition despite the reported emergency. The family he rescued survived, though they speak little of their experience, except to say that Dan O'Hara saved their lives before disappearing into the Alaskan wilderness. No trace was ever found. It was early February of 2012 when research pilot Dr. Eleanor Vance embarked on what she believed would be a routine data collection mission over the Kuskokwim River Delta. At 42, Eleanor was not only a skilled pilot, but also a respected climatologist studying permafrost patterns in western Alaska. Her specially equipped Piper PA-18 Super Cub contained sophisticated recording equipment designed to measure ice thickness and temperature variations from above. The university-funded project had been ongoing for 3 years without incident. Eleanor departed from Bethel at 9 a.m. on February 7th, with clear skies and temperatures hovering around -29 degrees. Her flight plan called for a 4-hour survey of the river delta, followed by a return to Bethel by early afternoon. The university research team expected regular data transmissions throughout the flight, as Eleanor had done on numerous previous occasions. The first 2 hours of the mission proceeded as planned. Eleanor transmitted her research data every 30 minutes, maintaining contact with the university research station in Fairbanks. Her last routine transmission came at 11 a.m., when she reported completing the eastern portion of her survey area. "Everything's going smoothly," her voice crackled over the radio. "Data quality is excellent. Moving to the western section now. We'll check in at 11:30. What happened next has perplexed aviation experts and paranormal investigators alike. At 11:32 a.m., the research station received a data transmission that was unlike any they had previously received from Eleanor. The file contained approximately 3 minutes of audio recordings captured by the plane's external microphones. But instead of the expected sounds of wind and aircraft operations, the recording contained something entirely different. The recording, which has been analyzed by audio experts at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, begins with the normal sounds of Eleanor's Super Cub flying over the delta. Then, approximately 45 seconds into the recording, a new sound becomes audible, a low, rhythmic thrumming that doesn't correspond to any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. Eleanor's voice can be heard, sounding concerned. "Control. This is Research Flight 49er. I'm picking up some unusual audio readings. There's something below me. Not on the ice. Coming through the ice." For the next minute, the recording captures Eleanor's observations as she circles the area. "The ice is vibrating," she notes, her voice maintaining scientific composure despite the unusual circumstances. "There's a pattern to it, almost like communication. I'm going to descend for a closer look. The readings are off the charts." What follows is the most disturbing portion of the recording. As Eleanor descends, the thrumming sound becomes more complex, almost like a language of clicks and tones that seem to respond to her aircraft's presence. "This is incredible," she breathes. "The ice is translucent here. I can see shapes moving beneath. They're organized. They know I'm here." The recording then captures approximately 30 seconds of what audio experts have described as biological sounds, unlike any known animal or human vocalization. Eleanor's final words on the recording are chilling. "They're signaling me to land. The ice here is thick enough. I think they want to show me something." The recording then cuts to static, followed by 3 minutes of silence before the aircraft's emergency locator transmitter activates. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the remote location and deteriorating weather conditions hampered efforts. It wasn't until 3 days later that rescuers located Eleanor's Super Cub. What they found at the coordinates of her final transmission defied explanation. The aircraft was sitting intact on the frozen river, with the engine cold but not damaged. The cockpit was empty, with Eleanor's research notes scattered across the passenger seat. The last entry in her logbook, written in her neat scientific handwriting, is read, "They're real. Beneath the ice. They've been here all along." The most baffling discovery was the condition of the ice around the aircraft. In a perfect circle approximately 50 feet in diameter, the ice had become mysteriously transparent, allowing clear visibility into the water below. Rescue team members reported seeing unusual formations on the riverbed, geometric patterns that appeared almost artificial in their precision. Dr. Robert Chen, who led the university's investigation into Eleanor's disappearance, described the scene in his official report. The ice transparency phenomenon cannot be explained by known physical processes. The temperature and atmospheric conditions at the site were consistent with surrounding areas. Yet only in this specific location did the ice become translucent. Furthermore, the patterns observed on the riverbed below do not correspond to any known natural formations. The Kuskokwim recording has been analyzed by numerous experts across multiple disciplines. Acoustic scientists have been unable to identify the source of the thrumming sounds, though some have suggested they might represent a form of communication from an unknown species. Geologists have no explanation for the localized transparency of the ice, and Eleanor Vance herself has never been found. The official investigation concluded with the finding that Dr. Vance likely succumbed to hypothermia after leaving her aircraft for unknown reasons. However, this explanation fails to address the bizarre evidence discovered at the site or the contents of her final recording. To this day, the Kuskokwim recording remains one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in Alaska's collection of unexplained phenomena. The university has sealed the original recording, though copies have circulated among research communities. Some speculate that Eleanor may have discovered evidence of an unknown species living beneath the frozen rivers of Alaska. Others suggest more supernatural explanations, drawing on local indigenous legends about the ice people who dwell below the frozen surface. Whatever the truth may be, Eleanor Vance's disappearance continues to haunt those who have studied her final moments. No trace was ever found. It was late March of 2007 when Bush pilot Mike Chen accepted what seemed like a straightforward charter flight. At 35, Mike was relatively new to Alaska's aviation scene, but had quickly earned a reputation for reliability and professionalism. His client was an archaeological team from the University of Alaska Anchorage, conducting excavations at a newly discovered site along the Kobuk River north of the Arctic Circle. The team needed transportation to and from their remote research location, a journey of approximately 280 miles from Kotzebue. Mike's aircraft, a Cessna 206 Stationair, was well suited for such missions, with ample cargo space and short takeoff and landing capabilities. The weather on March 15th, the day of the flight, was unseasonably mild for the region, with temperatures around -15 degrees and clear skies forecast for the entire route. Mike filed his flight plan at 7:30 a.m., estimating a departure time of 8:15 a.m. and an arrival at the research site around 10 a.m. The archaeological team consisted of 4 members: Dr. James Harrison, the expedition leader, his graduate assistant, Sarah Mitchell, and 2 local guides, brothers Samuel and Nathan Kiana, from the village of Kiana. The team had been working at the site for 2 weeks and was scheduled to return to Kotzebue for resupply before continuing their excavations. The first hour of the flight proceeded without incident. Mike maintained radio contact with the Kotzebue Flight Service Station, providing routine position reports. At 9:20 a.m., he reported passing over the village of Noorvik, approximately halfway to his destination. "Everything's running smoothly," his transmission recorded. "Passengers are comfortable. Weather holding as predicted. Should be on site in approximately 40 minutes. What happened next has become one of Alaska's most perplexing aviation mysteries. At approximately 9:47 a.m., the Kotzebue Flight Service Station received a garbled transmission from Mike's aircraft. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Mike's voice sounding unusually tense. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Charter Flight 819er. I've got something on the radar. Not aircraft, it's on the ground. moving fast, parallel to my course. The transmission then cuts to static for approximately 20 seconds before Mike's voice returns, now sounding genuinely frightened. It's keeping pace with me. Through the trees. Nothing can move that fast through this terrain. Dr. Harrison is looking at it through binoculars. He says it's not an animal, not anything he's ever seen. The final transmission from Flight 819 came at 9:51 a.m. Mike's voice is barely audible over what sounds like intense static. It stopped, in the clearing ahead. Just waiting. The shape is wrong. All wrong. We're going to try to. The transmission then cuts off completely. Despite repeated attempts by the flight service station to re-establish contact, no further communications were received from Mike or his passengers. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the remote location and the vastness of the terrain complicated efforts. 3 aircraft were dispatched to search the route Mike should have taken, but initial searches found no trace of the missing Cessna or its occupants. It wasn't until 2 days later, when satellite imagery was analyzed, that authorities located the crash site in a remote valley approximately 20 miles from the intended destination. What the rescue team found at the site would defy logical explanation. Mike's Cessna had made a controlled landing in a small clearing, sustaining only minimal damage to the landing gear. The aircraft was intact, with fuel in the tanks and no signs of mechanical failure. The rescue team found the doors open, but no sign of Mike or any of his passengers. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case No. 7-1124, details the bizarre scene. Personal items were scattered around the aircraft. Cameras, research equipment, and cold weather gear lay in the snow as if dropped in haste. Mike's flight log was open on the dashboard, with a final entry written in his characteristic neat handwriting. They're here. Not what we thought. Not from anywhere. Perhaps most disturbing were the tracks found in the snow around the aircraft. In addition to the footprints of the 5 people, there were other tracks that didn't correspond to any known animal or human. They were described as circular impressions approximately 8 inches in diameter, arranged in a pattern that suggests a bipedal creature with an unusual gait. The tracks led away from the aircraft into the surrounding forest, then simply disappeared after approximately 100 yards. The investigation into the disappearance of Mike Chen and the archaeological team raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file number ANC07FA089, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's and passengers' disappearance could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from the group experiencing a collective delusion brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning to more extraordinary explanations involving unknown creatures or even extraterrestrial entities. What makes this case particularly compelling is the background of Dr. James Harrison, the expedition leader. Before his disappearance, Dr. Harrison had been researching local indigenous legends about the Shadow Walkers, mysterious entities said to inhabit the remote regions of northern Alaska. According to these traditions, the Shadow Walkers were neither human nor animal, but something else entirely ancient beings that occasionally revealed themselves to those who ventured too deep into their territory. Samuel Kiana, one of the local guides who disappeared with the team, had spoken to village elders about Dr. Harrison's research before the expedition. The old ones warned him, the old ones. Samuel's widow later told investigators. They said that some places are not meant to be disturbed, that some things should remain buried. Dr. Harrison laughed it off, said it was just folklore. Samuel was worried. He said the doctor was obsessed with finding proof of the legends. Perhaps most puzzling is the discovery made by a follow-up archaeological team that visited the site 6 months later. In the excavation trench that Dr. Harrison's team had been working, they found unusual artifacts, objects made of a metallic substance unknown to modern science. with strange geometric patterns that seem to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The artifacts were confiscated by federal authorities and have never been made public. To this day, the Kobuk River incident remains unexplained. Mike Chen, Dr. Harrison, and the other 3 members of the expedition were officially declared dead in 2010, 3 years after their disappearance. Their aircraft was recovered and now sits in a storage facility at the University of Alaska Anchorage, occasionally studied by researchers who continue to puzzle over the strange circumstances of the incident. The site where they disappeared has been declared off-limits, officially due to environmental concerns, though many believe there are other reasons. No trace was ever found. It was early December of 2015 when cargo pilot Greg Thompson prepared for what should have been a routine flight across Norton Sound. At 49, Greg had been flying in Alaska for over 20 years, specializing in transporting goods between coastal communities. His aircraft, a Douglas DC-3 converted for cargo operations, was a reliable workhorse that had served him well through countless challenging missions. The flight from Unalakleet to Nome, a journey of approximately 150 miles, was one he had made hundreds of times before. The weather on December 3rd was typical for the region, temperatures around -25 degrees, with occasional light snow. Greg filed his flight plan at 2:30 p.m., estimating a departure time of 3 p.m. and an arrival in Nome at approximately 3:45 p.m. His cargo consisted primarily of mail and supplies for the community of Nome, with nothing particularly valuable or unusual. The first 30 minutes of the flight proceeded without incident. Greg maintained radio contact with the Nome Flight Service Station, providing routine position reports. At 3:25 p.m., he reported passing over the village of Shaktoolik, approximately halfway to his destination. "Everything's running smoothly down here," his transmission recorded. "Weather's holding steady. Should have visual on Nome in about 15 minutes. What happened next has become one of the most disturbing cases in Alaska's aviation history. At approximately 3:38 p.m., the Nome Flight Service Station received a frantic transmission from Greg's DC-3. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Greg's voice sounding genuinely terrified. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cargo Flight 39er Alpha. I've got something outside, all over the windows. Not ice, not anything I've ever seen." The transmission then cuts to static for approximately 15 seconds before Greg's voice returns, now breathing heavily. "They're tapping on the glass, all over the aircraft. The controls are not responding correctly. Something's interfering with the systems. I'm trying to maintain altitude, but..." The final transmission from Flight 39A came at 3:42 p.m. Greg's voice is barely audible over what sounds like intense tapping or scratching. "They're inside. How did they get inside? The cabin pressure is dropping. I can't breathe. Tell my family." The transmission then cuts off completely. Despite repeated attempts by the flight service station to re-establish contact, no further communications were received from Greg or his aircraft. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the fading daylight and deteriorating weather conditions hampered efforts. 2 aircraft were dispatched to search the route Greg should have taken, but initial searches found no trace of the missing DC-3. It wasn't until the following morning that rescuers located the crash site on the frozen Norton Sound, approximately 10 miles from Nome. What the rescue team found at the site would defy logical explanation. Greg's DC-3 had made a relatively controlled crash landing on the ice, sustaining significant damage to the wings and fuselage, but remaining largely intact. The rescue team found the cargo door slightly ajar, with packages scattered around the aircraft. What they didn't find was any sign of Greg Thompson himself. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case Voyager 15-987, details the bizarre scene. The cockpit windows were covered from the inside with what appeared to be frost patterns of unusual complexity, forming geometric shapes that didn't correspond to natural ice formations. The aircraft's control panels showed signs of unusual interference, with some instruments displaying readings that were physically impossible. Perhaps most disturbing were the marks found on the interior walls of the cargo hold. Investigators discovered hundreds of small, circular indentations, approximately a quarter-inch in diameter, arranged in patterns that suggested something had been pressing against the walls from the inside. The marks were too uniform to be caused by shifting cargo, yet too precise to be accidental. The investigation into Greg's disappearance raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file number ANC15FA076, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's disappearance and the aircraft's crash could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from Greg experiencing a psychotic episode brought on by hypoxia to more extraordinary explanations involving unknown entities. What makes this case particularly compelling is the testimony of a fisherman who was on the ice approximately 5 miles from the crash site at the time of the incident. In his official statement, he reported seeing strange lights moving in patterns around a plane that seemed to be flying erratically. He described the lights as small and blue, like sparks, but they moved with purpose, not like random sparks. Local indigenous elders spoke of ancient legends about the ice spirits entities that were said to inhabit the frozen waters of Norton Sound. According to these traditions, the ice spirits were neither physical nor spiritual in the conventional sense, but something in between beings that could interact with the physical world when conditions were right. "They are curious," one elder explained to investigators. "Sometimes they take things apart to see how they work. Sometimes they take people too." Perhaps most puzzling is the discovery made by the aircraft recovery team. When they examined the DC-3's communication systems, they found that the radio had been modified in ways that couldn't be explained by the aircraft's maintenance history. The modifications appeared to be designed to receive and transmit on frequencies that weren't used by conventional aviation communications. To this day, the Norton Sound disturbance remains unexplained. Greg Thompson was officially declared dead 2018, 3 years after his disappearance. His aircraft was recovered and eventually scrapped, though some components were retained by investigators who continue to study the strange modifications and damage patterns. The community of Nome still remembers the incident, with some pilots refusing to fly over that section of Norton Sound, especially during the winter months. No trace was ever found. It was mid-April of 2019 when wildlife biologist Dr. Rachel Morgan chartered a flight to the Barren Islands, a remote volcanic archipelago in the Gulf of Alaska. At 38, Rachel was conducting research on sea lion populations for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Her pilot, 62-year-old Jack Harrison, was a retired Navy aviator with over 40 years of flying experience in Alaska's challenging conditions. Jack's aircraft, a Grumman G-21 Goose amphibious plane, was perfectly suited for the mission, capable of landing on both water and rough terrain. The flight from Homer to the Barren Islands was approximately 150 miles, over open ocean in often unpredictable weather. On April 12th, conditions were unusually favorable, with clear skies and relatively calm seas. The temperature hovered around -5 degrees, mild for the season. Jack filed his flight plan at 9 a.m., estimating a departure time of 9:30 a.m. and an arrival at the islands around 10:45 a.m. The first hour of the flight proceeded without incident. Jack maintained radio contact with the Homer Flight Service Station, providing routine position reports. At 10:15 a.m., he reported passing over the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. Everything's running smoothly down here," his transmission recorded. "Weather's holding beautifully. Should have visual on the islands in about 30 minutes." What happened next has become one of Alaska's most perplexing aviation mysteries. At approximately 10:40 a.m., the Homer Flight Service Station received a garbled transmission from Jack's aircraft. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Jack's voice sounding unusually tense. "Homer, this is Research Flight 72 Bravo. I've got something on the water ahead. Not a vessel, not anything I recognize." The transmission then cuts to static for approximately 20 seconds before Jack's voice returns, now sounding genuinely concerned. "It's structures. Rising from the water, geometric, perfect angles. Nothing natural about them. Dr. Morgan is observing through binoculars. She's speechless." The final transmission from Flight 72B came at 10:46 a.m. Jack's voice is barely audible over what sounds like a low, pulsing hum. "They're moving. The structures are reconfiguring themselves, forming patterns. It's like they're communicating. We're going to descend for a closer look. The instruments are..." The transmission then cuts off completely. Despite repeated attempts by the Flight Service Station to re-establish contact, no further communications were received from Jack or his aircraft. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the remote location and vastness of the ocean complicated efforts. 3 aircraft and 2 Coast Guard vessels were dispatched to search the area around the barren islands, but initial searches found no trace of the missing Goose or its occupants. It wasn't until 2 days later, when a commercial flight passing nearby reported an unusual sighting, that authorities located the crash site on the largest of the barren islands. What the rescue team found at the site would defy logical explanation. Jack's Goose had made a controlled landing on a relatively flat section of the rocky island, sustaining only minimal damage to the fuselage. The aircraft was intact, with fuel in the tanks and no signs of mechanical failure. The rescue team found the doors open, with research equipment scattered around the aircraft. What they didn't find was any sign of Jack Harrison or Dr. Rachel Morgan. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case 19456, details the bizarre scene. The beach where the aircraft had landed was covered in unusual geometric patterns, as if something had been drawn in the sand with mathematical precision. The patterns were too complex to be natural formations, yet too precise to be random. Investigators also noted that several large rocks on the beach appeared to have been moved and arranged in specific configurations. Perhaps most disturbing were the photographs found in Dr. Morgan's camera, which had been recovered from the aircraft. The final images showed what appeared to be crystalline structures rising from the ocean, with surfaces that seemed to reflect light in impossible ways. The structures were arranged in patterns that suggested artificial design. Yet they were unlike any known architecture or natural formation. The investigation into the disappearance of Jack Harrison and Dr. Morgan raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file number ANC 19FA023, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's and passengers' disappearance could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from the pair experiencing a shared delusion brought on by sensory deprivation to more extraordinary explanations involving unknown underwater phenomena. What makes this case particularly compelling is the testimony of a commercial fisherman who was operating approximately 20 miles from the barren islands at the time of the incident. In his official statement, he reported seeing strange lights in the water that seemed to be moving in organized patterns. He described the lights as like nothing I've ever seen, not bioluminescence, not reflections, but something else entirely. Local indigenous elders spoke of ancient legends about the Deep Ones entities that were said to inhabit the waters around the barren islands. According to these traditions, the Deep Ones were ancient beings that occasionally revealed themselves, creating structures and patterns that defied human understanding. "They are not of our world," one elder explained to investigators. "Sometimes they take people to show them things beyond our comprehension." Perhaps most puzzling is the discovery made by a follow-up research team that visited the site 2 weeks later. The geometric patterns on the beach were still visible, despite wind and rain that should have erased them. When the team analyzed the sand, they found unusual crystalline structures that didn't correspond to any known mineral composition. The samples were sent to a laboratory for analysis, but the results were inconclusive, with the crystals seemingly changing composition when observed under different conditions. To this day, the Barren Islands mystery remains unexplained. Jack Harrison and Dr. Rachel Morgan were officially declared dead in 2022, 3 years after their disappearance. Their aircraft was recovered and now sits in a storage facility at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, occasionally studied by researchers who continue to puzzle over the strange circumstances of the incident. The Barren Islands have been declared a restricted area, officially due to wildlife protection concerns, though many believe there are other reasons. No trace was ever found. It was late January of 2001. Finarain, when medical pilot Maria Rodriguez received an emergency call that would change her life forever. At 36, Maria was one of the few female bush pilots in Alaska, known for her skill in navigating the most challenging conditions. She worked for a nonprofit organization that provided medical services to remote communities, often flying in weather that kept other pilots grounded. Her aircraft, a Cessna 207 Skywagon, was specially equipped for medical evacuations, with additional fuel tanks for extended range and an upgraded heating system for patient comfort. The emergency call came at 4:30 a.m. on January 18th. A young child in the remote village of Arctic Village, located approximately 100 miles north of Fort Yukon, was suffering from what appeared to be acute appendicitis and needed immediate medical attention. With temperatures hovering at -35 degrees and a storm approaching, Maria was the only pilot willing to attempt the rescue flight. Maria departed from Fairbanks at 5:15 a.m. with a flight nurse as her only passenger. The first hour of the flight proceeded without incident, though the weather conditions were challenging, with occasional snow and reduced visibility. At 6:20 a.m., she reported passing over Fort Yukon. Weather's deteriorating faster than expected, her transmission recorded. But we're still within safe parameters. Should be on site in approximately 45 minutes. What happened next has become one of Alaska's most disturbing aviation mysteries. At approximately 6:58 a.m., the Fairbanks Flight Service Station received a garbled transmission from Maria's aircraft. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Maria's voice sounding unusually tense. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Medevac Flight 49er Delta. I've got something outside the aircraft. Not ice. Not anything I've ever encountered." The transmission then cuts to static for approximately 30 seconds before Maria's voice returns, now sounding genuinely frightened. "It's all over the windows, like a film. But it's moving, pulsing. The instruments are going crazy. The compass is spinning. I'm trying to maintain heading, but..." The final transmission from Flight 49D came at 7:03 a.m. Maria's voice is barely audible over what sounds like a high-pitched whine. "We're going down. Can't see anything. The windows are completely covered. Tell my family." The transmission then cuts off completely. Despite repeated attempts by the flight service station to re-establish contact, no further communications were received from Maria or her aircraft. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, But the extreme weather conditions hampered efforts. The storm that had been approaching had intensified, creating whiteout conditions that made aerial search impossible. It wasn't 3 days later, when the weather finally cleared, that rescuers located the crash site in a remote valley approximately 20 miles from Arctic Village. What the rescue team found at the site would defy logical explanation. Maria's Cessna had made a relatively controlled crash landing in the snow, sustaining significant damage to the wings and fuselage, but remaining largely intact. The rescue team found the doors open, with medical supplies scattered around the aircraft. They also found the flight nurse, Sarah Jenkins, alive, but suffering from severe hypothermia and what appeared to be a psychological breakdown. What they didn't find was any sign of Maria Rodriguez herself. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case number 01234, details the bizarre scene. The aircraft windows were covered from the inside with a strange, crystalline substance that couldn't be identified by investigators. The substance was transparent but seemed to bend light in unusual ways, creating optical illusions when viewed from different angles. The aircraft's control panels showed signs of unusual interference, with some instruments displaying readings that were physically impossible. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Sarah Jenkins, the flight nurse who survived the crash. In her initial statements to investigators, she described what happened with a mixture of terror and confusion. "It started as a thin film on the windows," she recounted, "like frost, but it was spreading too fast. Then it began to pulse, like it was alive. Maria tried to scrape it away, but it just grew back. Then it started to form patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to move and change." According to Sarah, as the phenomenon intensified, the aircraft's systems began to malfunction. The compass started spinning. The altimeter was jumping up and down. The radio was picking up strange voices, speaking a language I'd never heard. Maria was trying to maintain control, but it was like the aircraft was being pulled in a different direction. Sarah's account of the final moments was even more disturbing. The substance completely covered the windows, so we couldn't see outside. Then it started to seep into the cabin through small cracks in the fuselage. It wasn't liquid or solid, it was something in between. Maria told me to brace for impact, and then we were on the ground. When I came to, the door was open and Maria was gone. I called for her, but there was no response. The cold was overwhelming, and I must have passed out again. The investigation into Maria's disappearance raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file Nomencu FA056, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's disappearance and the aircraft's crash could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from Maria experiencing a psychotic episode brought on by hypoxia to more extraordinary explanations involving unknown atmospheric phenomena. What makes this case particularly compelling is the testimony of elders from Arctic Village, who spoke of ancient legends about the sky curtain, a phenomenon that was said to occasionally appear during extreme cold conditions. According to these traditions, the sky curtain was not a natural phenomenon, but something else entirely, a barrier between worlds that could sometimes trap those who encountered it. Those who touch the curtain sometimes disappear, one elder explained to investigators. They go to another place beyond our understanding. Perhaps most puzzling is the discovery made by the aircraft recovery team. When they examined the crystalline substance found on the windows, they found that it had properties unlike any known material. It seemed to respond to temperature changes by changing its structure, and when analyzed under a microscope, it revealed patterns that appeared almost mathematical in their precision. Samples of the substance were sent to a laboratory for analysis, but the results were inconclusive, with the material seemingly defying classification. To this day, the Arctic Village incident remains unexplained. Maria Rodriguez was officially declared dead in 2004, 3 years after her disappearance. Her aircraft was recovered and eventually scrapped, though some components were retained by investigators who continue to study the strange substance and damage patterns. Sarah Jenkins, the flight nurse who survived, never returned to work as a flight nurse, citing ongoing psychological trauma from the incident. The child she was sent to rescue was evacuated by another pilot 2 days later and made a full recovery. No trace was ever found. It was early October of 2016 when geologist Dr. Thomas Wright chartered a flight to a remote research site in the Wrangell Mountains. At 52, Thomas was conducting research on volcanic activity for the U.S. Geological Survey. His pilot, 43-year-old Alex Kim, was a former military pilot with over 20 years of flying experience in Alaska's challenging conditions. Alex's aircraft, a Pilatus PC-6 Porter, was perfectly suited for the mission, capable of landing on short, unimproved airstrips at high altitudes. The flight from McCarthy to the research site was approximately 80 miles, over rugged mountain terrain that was among the most challenging in Alaska. On October 5th, conditions were favorable, with clear skies and relatively mild temperatures for the season, around -10 degrees. Alex filed his flight plan at 10:00 a.m., estimating a departure time of 10:30 a.m. and an arrival at the research site around 11:15 a.m. The first 30 minutes of the flight proceeded without incident. Alex maintained radio contact with the Anchorage Flight Service Station, providing routine position reports. At 11 a.m., he reported passing over the Nabesna Glacier. "Everything's running smoothly down here," his transmission recorded. "Weather's holding beautifully. Should have visual on the site in about 15 minutes." What happened next has become one of Alaska's most perplexing aviation mysteries. At approximately 11:12 a.m., the Anchorage Flight Service Station received a garbled transmission from Alex's aircraft. The recording, preserved in the FAA archives, captures Alex's voice sounding unusually tense. "Anchorage, this is Research Flight 31 Bravo. I've got something on the mountain ahead. Not a rock formation, not anything I recognize." The transmission then cuts to static for approximately 20 seconds before Alex's voice returns, now sounding genuinely concerned. "It's a structure, perfectly geometric, carved into the mountainside. Too precise to be natural. Dr. Wright is observing through binoculars. He's saying it's impossible." The final transmission from Flight 31B came at 11:18 a.m. Alex's voice is barely audible over what sounds like a low, resonant hum. The structure is changing, reconfiguring itself, opening. There's a light inside. Dr. Wright wants to get closer for photographs. We're descending to take a look. The instruments are. The transmission then cuts off completely. Despite repeated attempts by the flight service station to re-establish contact, no further communications were received from Alex or his aircraft. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the remote location and rugged terrain complicated efforts. 3 aircraft were dispatched to search the area around the research site, but initial searches found no trace of the missing Porter or its occupants. It wasn't until 2 days later, when a satellite passing overhead detected an unusual heat signature, that authorities located the crash site on a remote plateau in the Wrangell Mountains. What the rescue team found at the site would defy logical explanation. Alex's Porter had made a controlled landing on a relatively flat section of the plateau, sustaining only minimal damage to the landing gear. The aircraft was intact, with fuel in the tanks and no signs of mechanical failure. The rescue team found the doors open, with research equipment scattered around the aircraft. What they didn't find was any sign of Alex Kim or Dr. Thomas Wright. The Alaska State Troopers Incident Report, AST Case No. 16789, details the bizarre scene. The plateau where the aircraft had landed was covered in unusual geometric patterns, as if something had been etched into the rock with mathematical precision. The patterns were too complex to be natural formations, yet too precise to be random. Investigators also noted that several large boulders on the plateau appeared to have been cut and arranged in specific configurations. Perhaps most disturbing were the photographs found in Dr. Wright's camera, which had been recovered from the aircraft. The final images showed what appeared to be a massive structure carved into the mountainside, with surfaces that seemed to reflect light in impossible ways. The structure was geometric in design, with perfect angles and curves that defied natural explanation. The final images showed what appeared to be an opening in the structure, with a bright light emanating from within. The investigation into the disappearance of Alex Kim and Dr. Wright raised more questions than answers. The official NTSB report, NTSB file number ANC16FA034, concluded with the finding that the cause of the pilot's and passengers' disappearance could not be determined. Speculation has ranged from the pair experiencing a shared delusion brought on by altitude sickness to more extraordinary explanations involving unknown ancient structures or even extraterrestrial phenomena. What makes this case particularly compelling is the testimony of a mountaineer who was climbing in a nearby range at the time of the incident. In his official statement, he reported seeing a strange light on the mountain that seemed to appear and disappear in patterns. He described the light as not like sunlight reflection or anything natural. It was too controlled, too purposeful. Local indigenous elders spoke of ancient legends about the mountain builders entities that were said to have inhabited the Wrangell Mountains long before humans arrived. According to these traditions, the mountain builders were ancient beings that created structures and patterns that defied human understanding, occasionally revealing themselves to those who ventured into their domain. "They are not of our time," one elder explained to investigators. "Sometimes they take people to show them things beyond our comprehension." Perhaps most puzzling is the discovery made by a follow-up research team that visited the site 2 weeks later. The geometric patterns on the plateau were still visible, despite weather conditions that should have eroded them. When the team analyzed the rock, they found unusual crystalline structures that didn't correspond to any known mineral composition. The samples were sent to a laboratory for analysis, but the results were inconclusive, with the crystals seemingly changing properties when observed under different conditions. To this day, the Wrangell Mountains anomaly remains unexplained. Alex Kim and Dr. Thomas Wright were officially declared dead in 2019, 3 years after their disappearance. Their aircraft was recovered and now sits in a storage facility at the U.S. Geological Survey, occasionally studied by researchers who continue to puzzle over the strange circumstances of the incident. The plateau where they disappeared has been declared a restricted area, officially due to geological research concerns. Though many believe there are other reasons, no trace was ever found. The Alaskan wilderness remains vast and unknowable, a frontier where the boundaries between reality and mystery blur in the extreme cold. The stories we've explored tonight, from the disappearance of Flight 281 to the Wrangell Mountains anomaly, represent just a fraction of the unexplained phenomena that have occurred in America's last frontier. Each account, verified through official records and witness testimonies, challenges our understanding of what is possible in the most remote corners of our world. What connects these disparate incidents is not just the extreme cold or the isolation of the locations, but something more profound in the sense that in these vast, empty spaces, there are phenomena beyond our current comprehension. The bush pilots who vanished into thin air, the mysterious structures that appeared and disappeared, the strange sounds and lights that defied explanation all suggest that there are aspects of our world that remain hidden from most of us, revealed only to those who venture into the unknown. These stories serve as a reminder that despite our technological advances and scientific understanding, there are still mysteries that elude explanation. The Alaska sky, whether clear or stormy, holds secrets that we may never fully unravel. The pilots who fly through these skies are modern-day explorers, venturing into territories where the rules of our ordinary world sometimes seem to bend or break entirely. What becomes clear when examining these accounts is that the unknown is not necessarily hostile or malicious, but simply different, operating according to principles we have yet to understand. The entities or phenomena encountered by these pilots may not be seeking to harm, but rather exist in a state so alien to our experience that our interactions with them inevitably lead to confusion and disappearance. The silence that follows these incidents is perhaps the most haunting aspect of all. In a world where constant communication and tracking have become the norm, the complete absence of information or evidence is itself deeply unsettling. These are not cases with clear answers or neat resolutions. They are open-ended mysteries that continue to defy explanation, leaving us with more questions than answers. As we reflect on these stories, we're reminded of the courage of those who choose to fly in the most challenging conditions on Earth, connecting isolated communities and conducting research in environments that would be inhospitable to most of us. Their willingness to venture into the unknown, despite the risks, expands our knowledge and sometimes reveals phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The Alaskan wilderness, with its extreme cold and vast emptiness, serves as a perfect backdrop for these mysteries. It is a place where the normal rules sometimes seem not to apply, where the boundary between the known and unknown becomes thin and permeable. In such an environment, perhaps it's not surprising that occasionally something extraordinary happens, something that reminds us of how much we still have to learn about the world we inhabit. If you or someone you know has a true story to share about unexplained phenomena in Alaska's skies or wilderness, leave it in the comments below. The more we share these experiences, the better we can understand